My McCrae relatives have been in Ayrshire for a long time. If the trees on ancestry are correct, you can easily trace them back to Thomas McCrae, who was 2 years older than Mary Queen of Scots, and to 1592, when a George McCrae was born in the parish of Ochiltree near Ayr and very close to Cumnock, where my family members seem to have lived literally for centuries. My interest is in another George McCrae. This George was born 230 years later, on July the 2nd, 1830, on a farm called Lake Braes near Sorn, and only about 5 miles from Ochiltree. The family seems to have had a pretty stable existence. George's father, Andrew, was a small farmer. His mother, Agnes, was the daughter of a wool weaver, so they might have felt reasonably comfortable. Andrew was my great-great-great grandfather. He may have come from a long line of farmers going back to the 1600s, but there's no way that all the 13 children that Andrew and his wife Agnes produced could have or would have wanted to be farmers. In fact, the trend was towards bigger farms and fewer of them, so there weren't that many farms to go round. Andrew and Agnes had their last child, Elizabeth, in 1841. The 1841 census has them all living in Lake Braes, which is the farm that they've been on since George was born in 1830, or perhaps slightly before. But things go wrong in the 1840s. By 1847, Andrew McCrae is in debtor's prison and must have had a lot of creditors and a lot of debt, which had to be paid off. As a result, he lost the tenancy of his farm. By 1851, he is no longer a farmer. He is now a labourer, and he has to claw his way back to being a farmer again, as a 60-year-old. His old farm has new tenants. Their name is Valence. By 1861, he can once more describe himself as a farmer, but in a small way, with only 9 acres. By 1871, it looks as if he might be in a slightly better situation, but he was never prosperous. What seems to have happened is that the farm at Lake Braes became uneconomic, and of course the 1840s were a very difficult time generally, with 2 major depressions and the potato famine, which, although it hit Ireland hardest, had a major impact here too, especially in Ayrshire. The people who took over from Andrew also failed, and by 1851 the tenancy went to somebody called Valence, as I said. The 1855 valuation rolls show that the farm changed hands again. Here's Lake Braes, and it's gone to a tenant called John Logan. But up here, Muirhead is tenanted by this chap, James Craig. Now, he eventually takes over a bit more than just Muirhead, as we'll find out. So by 1865, Craig rented, among other things, not only Lake Braes, but the nearby things such as High Braes and the one we mentioned a minute ago, Muirhead. So he now has all 3 of these, and for these he was paying a substantial amount of rent. If you want to make this a bit bigger, you'll be able to see the whole thing. So what's happening here is that the way farming is working is changing. Bigger farms, which employed more labour, were taking over from small family farms that didn't really employ much labour at all, such as the one McCrae's had had. Andrew eventually dies in 1886 of old age, the death certificate says. But what of his children? Well, Andrew's eldest son, John, did become a successful farmer. We saw him earlier in the 1841 census, still staying with his parents. This is Whole House Mill Cottage. John's farm was called Whole House Mill. There are documents regarding Whole House Mill going way back to the 16th century. But by John's time, the mill no longer operated, and it became a small farm. This is reminiscent of my son Andrew's house near Aberfeldy, which is called Milton of Cluny, because it was a mill. Exactly the same thing happened there, but eventually other farms took the land, and all that my Andrew now has, is a house with a really large garden and a mill lathe running through it. So, this is William McCrae, Andrew McCrae's second son. Sometime around 1840, before the 1841 census certainly, he went off to London to be assistant to a wholesale draper and to learn the trade for himself. This may have been part of a family plan. It must have been clear to them that radical measures were necessary if the family was to thrive. William went off to London and succeeded very well there. This is him in later life. So that's why his name doesn't appear in this 1841 census, as I said. The family are still at Leif Braes. John is still with them at 25. George, that I started talking about, who is actually my great-great-grandfather and who I'll concentrate on later, is 11. Ages range from 6 to 25. 10 years later, in 1851, a national census was taken. This shows William in London. He now has a draper's business of his own. These businesses involved buying cloth from manufacturers at home and abroad and selling it to shops and other businesses throughout the UK using a network of travelling salesmen. The 1851 census shows William living in London with Agnes. There she is there. The couple had married 2 years before, as you can see down here. It seems that William set himself up in London through the 1840s and then came back to Ayrshire, married Agnes and took her back to London. You wonder what he made of his father's situation at that time and what kind of wedding it was. Agnes had probably already visited William in London. His younger brother Andrew certainly had, and by this time he was a draper on his own account in another part of London. Also in 1851, their eldest sister Mary was back in Ayrshire at the age of 33 with a baby that was born in England called William Hamilton. It seems likely that William Hamilton was born as the result of a relationship that Mary had while she was in London living with William. The census also shows that William's household in London contains his sister Marjorie and 5 more men. That's Marjorie there. All the men are from Ayrshire. One is 27 and is described as a travelling salesman. Marjorie goes on to marry him a few years later and they become farmers in Ayrshire. The second is Agnes's brother. The other 3 men are only 18. One is a travelling salesman that I cannot trace. One is William's brother James. This is him here. who is described as an assistant draper. The third is John Brown. John Brown will later marry William's second youngest sister, and he himself will become a successful London draper. This must have been William's plan: sell linens and woolens from London to Scotland through Scottish salesmen who are part of the family. In all, at least 6 of Andrew McCrae's 13 children, and many more of their friends, fiancés and spouses, went to London. Elizabeth married in December 1861. She was the youngest of the children and went to live in Paisley near James, who you maybe remember was in London but had now moved back to Paisley, married, but then lost his wife. We've already seen that some of the girls married Ayrshire farmers, and that 4 of the family made new lives as drapers or salesmen. The only one who did not seem to make a definite move of some sort was my great-grandfather, George. George seems to be a bit of an exception. He may have gone to London like his brothers, and if he did this at 18, he would have missed the 1851 census in London. But he doesn't appear in the Scottish one either. I cannot find him at all in 1851. He was probably boarding on a farm somewhere. Young men doing that can be difficult to pick up. But he does turn up 3 years later. It is June 1854, and he is 23 going on 24. He is in Tarbolton, this is him here, where the banns are being read out in church for his marriage to Joan Henderson. You can read at the top left of the slide where I showed you. The entry says that both he and Joan are new to the parish. I can't locate Joan anywhere, and I don't think the wedding ever took place. Bottom right of the slide is the page that the entry came from. This is the whole page. This is the marriage before them, this is the marriage after them, and so on. But if you see, what normally happens with a marriage is that they write all the banns out like this, and then they just have a little line or a line and a half that's separate and very short, just saying that the wedding actually took place. The same kind of thing went on down here, and you can see it's been squeezed in a wee bit. But here, there's a space. I think what happened was that the wedding never took place, and that space then was never filled in. We next see George in 1861. He is now 30 or 31. He's unmarried, and he's working as a storekeeper. This probably means looking after stores, say in a mine or other business. He is boarding in the house of an engineman, probably at a local pit, the engineman's wife and their 7 children. The family took in 4 boarders, another engineman, a labourer, George himself, and the railway guard that you can see. In 1864, George did finally marry. He married Mary Read. Mary's family are a bit difficult to follow. Her mother, Rosina, died sometime in the 1840s. Her father remarried in 1850 to Elizabeth Kenmure, who became Mary's stepmother. But by this time, Mary was 12 and would soon be leaving. The following year, 1851, the census shows that the Read family were living in Kilwinning, where Mary's father is a pig iron weigher. All the surnames of the children are given correctly here, but the parents have not been copied properly. I think that Mary lived in ironworkers' housing at Kilwinning for perhaps 3 years before getting a job as a house servant in Kilmarnock. And that's what she was doing when she met and married George. James Hodson here is probably the result of Elizabeth's previous marriage. This is George and Mary's marriage certificate. It shows George as a bachelor, and it says he is a hammerman. It's difficult to be sure, but that is, I think, what that says. That means he's a metal worker in Kilmarnock. When his first child is born in Riccarton in 1866, he's still a hammerman. The next child, Robert, is born in Kilmarnock. By the 1871 census, George is a labourer, and he is living in one room in what I take to be the Free Church manse. George has not gone on in life like his brother, well, like any of his brothers and sisters, I think. And that's what makes me wonder, is there some problem? Where you see that it's just one room they live in is this column here. What that says, you won't be able to read it, is how many rooms without a window. So perhaps they had 2 rooms and one of them didn't have a window, but this is 1881. George has now joined the railway as a lamp cleaner. This seems to have been a very good move. The family have moved into railway housing at Burleith, known locally as the Blocks. The Blocks had just been built. In fact, when George moved in, parts of them were still being built. This is the whole family, including a lodger. Note the address is 11.5 B block here. I haven't been able to work out what that means, but it was only out of about 140 houses, I think only 6 or so had a half like that in them. So this is the best picture I could find of the Blocks. The school is the protruding part here, and the caption says it's D block. Well, D block extends to the left like this, and you can see the first few houses of B block to the right there, which is where George lived. Of the 140 or so houses, only 6 have half in the address, as I said before. And there isn't a second 11.5. I thought maybe there would be 2 11.5s, but it wasn't that either. I suppose it could be that that one is smaller than the others, but I don't know. Blocks A and C are opposite in this direction where you can't see, and this shed in the foreground and the other similar sheds are wash houses, and also they can keep cold. This is the plan of the house, with these recesses for set-in beds, 3 of them in the whole thing, and this is the semi-detached flat next door, of course, with the recesses in the places here and here. They still have a lodger. George died in 1888 at the age of 53. The cause of death is given here as ulcers of the stomach, and it took him 4 days to die. Now, I see that he is, the thing has been certified by a surgeon, and I don't know if that perhaps means that George was being operated on and that the operation failed. I can't see any other reason why it would be a surgeon who would be signing the certificate. You'll see as well that George, who was a lamp cleaner, has now graduated to become an engine cleaner. His death left Mary with 4 children. Fortunately, the oldest was 22, and this is my great-grandfather, Andrew McCrae. 2 years later, he married Isabella McKillop. This is my grandfather's mother. So, of course, there are as many people to consider in her side of the family as there are in Andrew's side. And just as Andrew's father, George, seems to have had a hard time in a lot of ways, Isabel's father and mother did too. And I'm leaving their story until part 2 of this slideshow.